Andrew Zemek, 15 months since we last had a catch up on manganese. What's happened since then?
Well, a lot has happened, of course. 15 months is a long time in the commodities market, and particularly in the area which I cover, which is high purity manganese, and a whole lot of developments both on the mining side, the processing side, and also on the demand side.
Rather than going straight into the battery side of the market, why don't we just talk about the general ore market for manganese to kick things off?
So, as your viewers might remember from our previous discussions, majority of manganese which is mined, which is about 90%, in fact in 2022 it was 94%, goes into steel production. So the fortunes of the manganese markets are very much tied to the situation in the steel market, and that was this situation wasn't brilliant in the last year or so. In fact, we experienced nearly 19 straight months of steel production declines, which is much longer than during the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, when we only had about 12 months of consecutive drops in steel production. So that's worrying. June and July were a bit better. The production of steel started growing again, particularly in China. But for the first 7 months of 2023, the global production is still minus 0.1% on the year before, and China is slightly better. It's plus 2.5%. So the demand for manganese from the steel industry is very much mirroring this. And as a result of that, there was less production of ore and less production of ferroalloys and less production of manganese metal and other manganese products. But it was different in different groups. So the ore production is down in 2022 compared to 2021 just by 2%. It probably should be reduced further, because otherwise the stocks start building up because there is not enough demand. And the metal production, the EMM, electrolytic manganese metal, that's a disaster. It's 40% down on the year before, and this resulted in some shift of demand. So some steel makers stopped using manganese metal and started using manganese ferroalloys, which are cheaper than the metal because they don't contain that much manganese and they are not as far processed as the metal is. And so this production picked up a little bit, just 1% up on the year before, but it doesn't make up for the loss of metal demand.
Obviously, 90% of manganese goes into obviously the steel market predominantly. That's obviously recognising why we're sort of seeing that steel post growth in China, etc. Are we seeing the same sort of trends for the battery market for manganese?
In a word, yes, but for different reasons. So the reasons the battery grade materials made of manganese have declined in price is not linked to the cheap price of metallurgical manganese. It's more to do with the supply and demand situation in the chemical sector or in the battery sector. And here we have something which I nicknamed an LFP trough. It's a funny term, but I will explain what I mean by that. LFP is a type of battery chemistry which is not using manganese, or not using manganese today, but about to use manganese tomorrow. And since the withdrawal of the subsidies in China for higher energy density batteries, which are essentially of the NMC type, many producers shifted to LFPs. The LFPs not using manganese. So this demand went away from manganese into iron and phosphate, hence a decline in demand. But the LMFPs, the manganese using LFP batteries, which are much more powerful, about 20% more energy density than the traditional old style LFPs, their commercial production hasn't started yet in earnest. The first producers on a commercial scale are only starting about in China about now. We are expecting bigger volumes in Q4 23 and from then on. In fact, we see LMFPs, meaning the LFPs with manganese, to account for something like 50% of all LFP type batteries by 2032.
Oh.
And this gives this very significant boost to manganese demand, which is frequently overlooked.
Well, why don't we talk about the price? Where's the price of manganese right now?
Well, the price of manganese metal for metallurgical purposes is at around $2,000 per ton in Rotterdam.
Mm-hmm.
That is a far cry from $7,500, which we had in 21-22. The average of 2022 was about 4,500. So that's not great, but it's not that far from historical averages.
Yeah.
The price of chemical high purity manganese sulfate is, I'm afraid to say, close to the floor. In fact, it's close to the Chinese cost of production, or even below that now, so it can't stay there for very long. The recent check I did, which was a couple of days ago, is about $730 per ton of sulfate.
Wow.
Down from nearly 1,700 about a year and a bit ago. So that situation is not good, but this situation carries the seeds of even greater deficits in the future, because this low price discourages investments, delays financing of the projects which are already in the pipeline, and as a result of that, 5 years down the line, we will have less manganese available than we previously thought, and demand is going to be bigger than we previously thought.
Why is that price so low? Just wanted to touch on that. It was obviously one of the main, I guess, benefits of manganese that we've always spoken about in the past is that it's less volatile than the other metals,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm not saying it's particularly volatile at the moment at current prices, but I guess the main point I'm trying to work out at the moment is this mainly an oversupply from Chinese processing, or is this because there's more batteries being produced right now than ever before, right?
Indeed, that's a combination of quite a few factors. We are still having a remnants of the COVID pandemic results, stock buildup, but I must say that manganese is not unique in that sense. I have here a chart showing the battery metal prices over the last 5 years, and as you can see here, from the beginning of 2023, nickel, manganese and cobalt are moving almost in parallel, even though they come from different countries. Well, they have one thing in common: they are mostly processed in China. So that's not just manganese which is suffering because of that. Partially that's the result of what I already mentioned, the shift towards LFP chemistries, which are not using nickel and not using cobalt. Partially that's slightly smaller battery packs, particularly in China, and partially the general sort of economic outlook, which is not that great at the moment.
Yeah. What about changes in battery chemistries? You're talking about obviously there that a lot of people that changed over to LFP. We're sort of waiting for the LFMP to come on online. What impacts could that have on demand?
Yeah, this landscape is very interesting. I recently watched a lot of David Attenborough, and so I'm under the influence of this kind of evolutionary animal world comparisons. That's why I like to talk about subspecies. So the traditional species of batteries like NMC and NCA and LFP and so on started producing subspecies. I call them their offsprings. And let me give you an example. So a very promising chemistry for manganese use is NMC 370. That's the technology developed by the German chemical company BASF. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know those naming conventions, NMC 370 means 3 parts nickel, 7 parts manganese, 0 parts cobalt. So this chemistry produce an offspring which is called NMC 451. So nickel goes up from 3 to 4, manganese goes down from 7 to 5, and cobalt goes up from 0 to 1. So this battery, for the same number of kilowatt hours or gigawatt hours, needs less manganese than 370. Similarly, the very promising technology NMC 811, which is eight part nickels, 1 manganese, 1 cobalt, produced a subspecies of NMC 90.0.0.
Wow.
So that's using just half of the manganese which was used before. However, these subspecies are not replacing their parent species. They coexist in this ecosystem side by side for different applications. But temporarily, they have a detrimental effect. So the demand is less, sort of particularly in nearby years. But then the very volume of things, plus the LMFPs, so LFPs with manganese, start taking over, and this more than compensates for those more efficient subspecies. And we haven't even started talking about the Tesla batteries, traditionally not using manganese, NCA, nickel, cobalt, aluminium. And now Panasonic, the main supplier to Tesla, officially says in their presentations that they are going to be producing NMCAs, nickel, manganese, cobalt, aluminium. So that needs to be factored in. We don't factor it in yet because it's too little. We have too little data about it. Another new development in the chemistries are sodium batteries, and that's the very interesting one, because many people say, oh, it's still experimental, it's still for electric scooters and things like that, it's small scale and so on, but not anymore. The advances in technology means that some people, like our esteemed colleagues from Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, they forecast something like 500 gigawatt hours of sodium-ion batteries by 2031 or 32. Some companies, I think that was Restart Energy, they even talk about 500 gigawatt hours of sodium-ion batteries by 2032. What does it mean for manganese? Well, this means more demand, because even though we haven't settled as yet for one single chemical formula for those sodium-ion batteries, there are several species, layered oxide, Prussian blue, and so on. But essentially, they have very similar manganese loading per kilowatt hour to the traditional chemistries like NMC. So while they might not be using lithium, and this might be bad news for lithium, that sodium ion are gaining traction, but for manganese this is excellent news.
What about solid state batteries? Is there any?
Solid state is progressing. However, to us it's immaterial, because solid state is all about electrolyte, where we're essentially replacing kind of gel, which technically speaking it's a liquid, but in practical terms it's a gel, replacing it with solid state, as the name implies, which is more like glass. And so that's the electrolyte, but the cathode stays the same.
Okay. Talk to me about supply responses, because obviously around this, again, what I'd really love to get my head around here with manganese is the capacity for China to keep ramping up demand, keep supplying processed material and dampening prices. Obviously you were in China not too long ago, earlier this year. What did you find out there?
Indeed. I was in China in March. That was a major conference almost exclusively devoted to this part of material, high purity manganese, both in metal form and chemical form. The trip included visits to 2 high purity manganese sulfate plants, which were extremely interesting, both from the point of view of actually seeing it in operation, but also, even more so, talking to the management, who, to our surprise, were very open about things even like cost of production and the problems they have and whatever. And so what we found out is that first, they are very unhappy with the prices where they are now, even though in March the prices were even higher than they are today. And they say, we can't live like that, the margins are too thin, the price must go up because otherwise we will stop producing. The second thing they do, they started switching some of their production to manganese oxides. And this is something unrelated to China, but the general phenomenon in this industry, those new chemistries like LMFPs, NMCAs, they might be using two raw materials, either the sulfate or oxide. And for those who are chemically minded, there are numerous oxides, manganese oxides. It's a very versatile metal. So we are talking here about Mn2O3 and Mn3O4. These two oxides are the feedstock for these new chemistries. I also need to mention, when talking about new chemistries, about the new abbreviation, which will make, well, is already making headlines, but will make even more headlines. Yep. HLM, which, depending which source you read, is either highly lithiated manganese or high lithium manganese. That's the chemistry developed by Umicore, the Belgian chemical producer and cathode active material producer. And it contains up to 60% of manganese in the cathode, so it's very high concentration. And they made an announcement, I think it was in March, that they are starting commercial production of this cathode active material. So it's again good news for manganese.
What does the long-term supply response look like in terms of, because obviously incentive pricing needs to be a lot higher than the 730 it is for sulfate at the moment. How do we get away from a dependence on China and their dominance in terms of being able to turn the tap on and off?
The short answer is one word: inadequate. And that applies both to outside of China and inside of China. In fact, Chinese production, I would say, disappoints a little bit. So in March we learned about the production results for 2022. And the Chinese production grew just 15% compared to the year before, which for China is very little.
Yeah.
Now we have the first data for the first half of 2023, and by the look of it, the production for the whole year, 2023, may be lower than the year before. So to those my detractors who used to say, oh, the China will flood the market with cheap manganese, I'm saying, where's the flood? We are sort of more like, maybe not a drought yet, but certainly not a flood. And in fact, when we look at our projections, it looks to us that by 2032, China, rather than being the supplier of the world, may turn into net importer if they don't develop more processing capacity. I know that today it sounds like a heresy to say that China may be an importer, when today they are the supplier of the world. But this is how the numbers stack up when we look into the future.
That also suggests quite a lot of dominance in terms of Chinese EV manufacturing as well, though, doesn't it? If they're going to be a net importer.
It is. In fact, we just yesterday or today, I read in the Mining Journal, there is, believe it or not, a Chinese mobile phone maker going into EV production.
Wow.
And they just got an approval from the government to produce 200,000 vehicles a year from, I don't remember whether it's from next year or year after, but quite soon.
And can China continue to keep subsidizing this industry? Obviously they were back in 2017, 2018.
Now they are gradually withdrawing those subsidies. They think there is enough momentum in the sector. But what is of interest to many of our viewers is, what's happening outside of China.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen any significant changes in the project pipeline. So essentially the projects I was talking about a year ago, they are still here, and their numbers haven't increased in any significant way. Maybe one or two other projects sort of started showing their heads above the water and saying, we want to produce and we have feasibility studies underway and so on. But the traditional, the older contenders also published numerous press releases, and these press releases are essentially saying one word: delay, both in financing or in advancing things on the ground. The good example, which I'm happily giving here, is South 32. It's the largest manganese ore producer in the world. Until recently, not really interested in the manganese materials for batteries, announced the development of the Hermosa project in Arizona in November 2022. But the recent press release from them says they need to build an incline to get into the deposit, which is deep underground, and they cannot access enough material even for the bulk samples from the surface. And this incline will not be ready until the end of 2025. And only then they can produce bulk samples and produce some sulfate to be tested by the car makers. Mm-hmm. And initially this production will be small, 2,000 tons a year to maybe 5 or 10,000 tons a year. So the overall production in the future will be high. It will be 185,000 tons. That's what they say. But this will not materialize for at least 5-6 years, maybe longer.
I think, well, if we're in an area where we have sort of high stockpiles at the moment, obviously low incentive prices, I think there is justification for delay, isn't there, realistically? Indeed.
I think what we will see in the future, probably not so distant future, is the diversification of prices, the China price and the non-China price, or as you just called it, an incentive price. The non-Chinese producers cannot match Chinese cost of production because of the cost of labor and many other things. And if a European or American battery maker wants to have a supply, local supply from America or from Europe, or indeed even from Africa, even from South Africa, they have to accept the higher price, because otherwise this project will not happen. And if these projects will not happen, for now we'll be happy with Chinese supply, but after a while, after 2030, even China will not be sufficient to supply to satisfy the demand.
What about, I guess, even looking at the rest of the world, the Western world, what sort of regulatory and political sort of environment are we in at the moment, and how might that impact?
That's a very interesting area. The most talked about piece of legislation in recent months is Critical Minerals Act of the European Union. The text was published in March. That is yet to be discussed and approved by the European Parliament. But there are very interesting items in it, including a bar on importing raw materials at any stage, so that includes manganese sulfate. The imports cannot be higher than 65% from one single country. So whether we are talking European Union level or country level or company level, it still comes to the same thing, that the European demand cannot be satisfied in more than 65% from one country. Hence, there is a need to develop assets in other countries to meet that criterion.
Yeah. Final conclusions. What are your thoughts looking out to 2030? You're talking about, and one thing in particular I wouldn't mind you just clearing up in my mind as well is, obviously we were mentioning that LFP batteries going to start seeing manganese introduced to them by the end of this year, and we'll start to see processing increase for that. What does that mean as well, as in moving into even the next couple of years?
Final conclusions. If I go back to the basics, to the mining and metallurgical applications to start with, no fireworks here. So the steel production is picking up, but sort of is picking up with difficulty. I saw some forecasts for the next 10 years of steel production, predicting a compound growth, annual growth rate of just 0.7%, up to 2032. So that's not really good. The construction sector in China, not very good shape. Credit availability, not very good shape. So we are not expecting fireworks in steel production and steel demand, and hence demand for manganese from that sector. Much more interesting situation in the battery subsector. It's a story of two halves. So right now we are in the surplus situation, and we are likely to remain in the surplus situation for the next 2-3 years. From 2027-28 we see a definite shift into deficit, even if all the projects in the pipeline go ahead, you know, smoothly, with no delays, no technical delays, no financing delays, no unexpected turbulence in the world markets. If all of them go ahead, they will still be in the surplus to 2027, but after that, no matter what, we go into a deficit. And by 2032, this deficit will be significant. So we used to say in my many previous interviews with you and some other people that the global production of manganese, high purity manganese, that's important, high purity manganese, needed to grow by 8 times, and we were predicting it will grow by 4.5 times. Now we are saying by 2032, to satisfy the demand, the global production of high purity manganese needs to grow 9.5 times, and we expect that the production response will make it grow 5.5 times. So both numbers increased. The demand number increased and the supply demand also increased, but the gap is still there, and this is a very significant gap.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because as we move forward, chemistries will change again, and supply responses could potentially change. It's one of them where hopefully we don't leave it 15 months next time, and we can have a catch up again soon and see where the market is.
That would be very useful, particularly that there are a number of question marks in this market, which I hope will be answered in about 6 months' time. For example, there is one big project in China which intends to produce high purity manganese sulfate from metal containing selenium, and that the common knowledge tells us that's a big no-no for the battery industry. But they are saying we will have buyers, and maybe they will, maybe they won't, and we don't know what the quality of this product is going to be until the first products, bags of product roll out of the production line, and there is a response from the market. So many question marks, very interesting market to watch, a lot's happening there, and I must say, immodestly blowing our own trumpet, and not much expertise of these things around, because it's such a niche product.
No, agreed. Even groups that do focus on battery metals don't usually focus on manganese quite as much, and I do appreciate
so
that.
we do. So dear viewers, if you need this information, you know where to come.
CPM Group. Andrew, until next time, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.